In the year 1901, Springfield, Illinois witnessed a remarkable event. The body of Abraham Lincoln, assassinated 36 years earlier, was lifted out of the ground one last time. Lincoln's coffin had suffered more than most could imagine. It had been targeted by grave robbers, hidden under cellar timbers, buried secretly, and opened repeatedly to confirm he was truly inside. Finally, his remains were sealed forever in a massive block of cement 64 square feet, never to be disturbed again. A generation had passed since the night of April 1865, when a single bullet took his life. Yet, again and again, America returned to his memory, his story, his words. This is the story of Abraham Lincoln, the man at the center of America's greatest trial. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a small cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky. His earliest memories came from Knob Creek, a valley surrounded by hills and deep forests. His father, left an orphan at 6, had little education and worked hard to survive. Lincoln later said, "It is strange that I, a boy brought up in the woods, should drift into the very heart of such great events." Life was rough. His mother died when he was just 9 years old. His father remarried, and his stepmother, Sally Johnson, became a kind and guiding presence. Young Abraham had little schooling, less than 1 year in total, but he taught himself to read, write, and do arithmetic. He read constantly, scratched notes on wooden boards when he had no paper, and shaved them clean with a knife to write again. By the age of 21, Lincoln struck out on his own. He worked on farms, split rails, ran a store, served as a postmaster, and later trained himself in law. From lawyer to leader. In 1837, Lincoln moved to Springfield, Illinois, to begin his law career. Tall, awkward, but sharp-witted, he quickly made friends and built a reputation as a skillful lawyer and storyteller. Love came hard for him. He suffered heartbreaks and even depression, at one point fearing he might never marry. But in 1842, he wed Mary Todd, a well-educated and ambitious woman from Kentucky. Together, they built a life on 8th Street in Springfield, raising 4 sons, though only one, Robert, would live to adulthood. The road to the presidency. Lincoln's rise in politics was steady but slow. He served a single term in Congress, became known through debates with Stephen Douglas, and delivered powerful speeches like the Cooper Union Address. By 1860, the nation was tearing apart over slavery. At the Republican National Convention in Chicago, Lincoln was the surprise choice for president, a little-known prairie lawyer with no executive experience. His simple pledge, slavery must not spread into new territories. When he won the election, Southern states immediately began to secede. The country was headed toward crisis. Farewell to Springfield. In February 1861, Lincoln prepared to leave his home for Washington. 6 states had already seceded. Threats of assassination followed him everywhere. At the Springfield depot, he said a tearful goodbye to his neighbors. "Here I have lived a quarter of a century, and here my children were born, and one is buried. I now leave, not knowing whether I shall return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington." On the journey east, crowds gathered at every station to see the tall, bearded man who would soon be president. But the trip was shadowed by danger. In Baltimore, word came of an assassination plot. Disguised in an overcoat and soft hat, Lincoln slipped quietly through the city at night. A nation divided. On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln was sworn in as the 16th President of the United States. His speech pleaded for unity. "We are not enemies but friends. We must not be enemies." But just weeks later, Confederate guns fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The Civil War had begun. As the war raged into its second year, Lincoln faced the greatest moral and political dilemma of his presidency. At its heart, the conflict was not only about preserving the Union, but also about the soul of the nation, whether the United States would remain half slave and half free, or finally take a decisive stand against human bondage. Lincoln, ever cautious, had long wrestled with the question of emancipation. He knew that to strike directly at slavery was to risk driving the border states Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware into the arms of the Confederacy. Yet, as casualties mounted and Union soldiers returned home in coffins, The cries for a higher purpose grew louder. Abolitionists, church leaders, and free black communities pressed Lincoln to act, reminding him that a war fought merely to preserve territory would lack the moral fire needed to sustain it. Slowly, Lincoln's mind and heart shifted. He came to see emancipation not only as a moral imperative, but as a weapon of war, one that could cripple the Confederacy's economy and sap its will to fight. In the summer of 1862, after the Union's narrow and bloody stand at Antietam, Lincoln seized the moment. He drafted the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, announcing that as of January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in the rebelling states shall be thenceforward, and forever free. The world watched in astonishment. For the first time, the United States had declared liberty, not compromise, as the heart of its struggle. Foreign governments, particularly Britain and France, who considered recognizing the Confederacy, recoiled from aligning themselves with a rebellion now clearly fighting to preserve slavery. For Lincoln, the decision was both deeply personal and profoundly political. He knew that history would judge his presidency on this single act. The weight of centuries of injustice pressed upon his shoulders. Yet when the clock struck midnight on New Year's Day, 1863, Lincoln took up his pen, his hand trembling from exhaustion, and signed the document that would redefine the Union cause and forever reshape the meaning of freedom in America. The weight of war. Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers. In cities across the North, men rushed to enlist. Flags waved, and bands played. Many believed the war would be short, but reality struck hard. Union forces were crushed at the First Battle of Bull Run. Washington lay almost defenseless, and Lincoln realized the war would be long and bloody. The president worked endlessly, often until midnight, surrounded by visitors, generals, and office seekers. His cabinet doubted him, newspapers mocked him, and many called him unfit for office. Some even called him a dictator when he suspended habeas corpus and ordered arrests of Confederate sympathizers. Yet, despite the chaos, Lincoln grew stronger. Slowly, he learned to trust his own judgment above his generals and advisors. Family and grief. The White House was not just a seat of power, but also a family home. Lincoln adored his sons. His youngest, Tad, was mischievous and ran wild through the halls. His middle son, Willie, was gentle, intelligent, and the president's favorite. In 1862, tragedy struck. 11-year-old Willie fell gravely ill with typhoid fever. Lincoln was crushed when his boy died. He visited the tomb again and again, unable to let go. But in time, he chose not to drown in grief. He said, "I believe it is the right of man to be happy or miserable at his own decision. I choose the former." Mary Todd Lincoln, however, never fully recovered. With her Southern relatives fighting for the Confederacy, she faced suspicion in Washington. Grief and pressure drove her into bouts of overspending, secrecy, and instability. The burden of command. Despite his lack of military experience, Lincoln threw himself into running the war. He inspected troops, visited camps, and even traveled to the battlefield. He pushed for innovation, supporting ironclad warships and new strategies. Frustrated by cautious generals like George McClellan, Lincoln finally declared, "General McClellan must either act or step aside." Bit by bit, Lincoln transformed from the uncertain prairie lawyer into a determined commander-in-chief. The final days and legacy. By the spring of 1865, the long nightmare was drawing to a close. The Confederate armies were crumbling. General Robert E. S. Lee's forces were retreating, hungry and desperate, across the Virginia countryside. Washington buzzed with anticipation of peace. Yet for Lincoln, triumph was bittersweet. He had witnessed too much death, carried too much sorrow, and bore the lines of war on his weary face. On April 9, 1865, news reached the capital that Lee had surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Bells rang, cannons roared in salute, and citizens poured into the streets in jubilation. For the first time in 4 bloody years, it seemed the Union might breathe again. Lincoln himself walked the streets of Washington, greeted by crowds who reached out simply to touch his hand, as though he were a living symbol of deliverance. Yet, behind the celebrations, shadows lingered. Lincoln had already begun to speak of binding up the nation's wounds, of reconciliation rather than revenge, of welcoming the South back as brothers rather than crushing them as enemies. He urged mercy where others demanded punishment, forgiveness where many clamored for vengeance. But fate would deny him the chance to complete that work. On the evening of April 14, Good Friday, Lincoln and his wife Mary attended a play at Ford's Theater. In a cruel twist of destiny, while laughter filled the hall, a lone figure crept into the presidential box. With the crack of a pistol shot, the hopes of a nation were shattered. Abraham Lincoln, who had guided America through its darkest trial, breathed his last the following morning. In the decades and centuries that followed, Lincoln's words and deeds would echo in classrooms, in speeches, in the struggles for justice that outlived him. More than a president, Abraham Lincoln had become a myth, a symbol, and a reminder that leadership in its highest form demands sacrifice, vision, and unyielding faith in the better angels of our nature.